big of a fan were you of Mid-Atlantic, Jim Crockett? How big a player was it in the 70s?
They were my home promotion. I mean, they were the ones that I had the most access to, not only on television, but as far as their touring schedule. So, they were a huge deal to me in the early to mid 80s. They did good business with a number of people that would go on to be more recognizable later on, largely thanks to Vince pushing everything to a national product. That's where Ric Flair rose to prominence. That's where you got the Dusty and Flair feuds. That's where Sergeant Slaughter, Ricky Steamboat, these guys.
Can I add a unique fact about the Mid-Atlantic, Gavin, if you don't mind?
Sure.
Generally, when you think of a territory and their top acts, you always think of a single. The Mid-Atlantic was a tag team territory.
Yeah.
For the majority of its existence prior to it turning eventually into, what we know as WCW.
How much of that has to do with the Road Warriors?
None.
I mean,
really?
Some, but not certainly not totally.
No, I know they were like the preeminent act in the world for the longest time.
What? Long before
there was
Road Warriors.
The Road Warriors really came into significant prominence around 1983.
Okay.
Yeah.
And they kind of started their downhill trajectory when their WWF run ended.
Well, yeah, that much I knew.
But in the middle of that run from 83 to, we'll call it 91, there was a legitimate time where for 2.5 years, the Rock and Roll Express were absolutely the biggest team in the territory, if not the sport.
Right, and they're pretty synonymous with Mid-Atlantic.
But even going back to the 70s heyday of Mid-Atlantic, you're talking about the top acts that drew the most money there were Gene and Ole Anderson, the Minnesota Wrecking Crew, Ric Flair and Rip Hawk, where Flair's original big break was him and Rip Hawk as a tag team together.
Yep.
After Rip Hawk basically retired, Flair would team with Greg Valentine.
Right.
And they became a massive team. Ricky Steamboat and Paul Jones were a huge team in the Mid-Atlantic territory.
And then Steamboat and Youngblood.
He would go on to team with Jay Youngblood, absolutely. But again, it was really the main events in that territory were tag team main events. Even look at Jimmy Snuka and Paul Orndorff, as weird a team as that sounds like.
Yeah.
They were a huge team there and made money. And all of these guys became huge stars as singles competitors.
I'm sorry. Jimmy Snuka and Paul Orndorff. I'm sure I could say this about a lot of guys, but those guys in particular, especially after what we talked about, so much muscle, so little brains.
Oh, without a doubt.
It was like somebody like used weird science to make like tackling dummies come alive, and they became Paul Orndorff and Jimmy Snuka. I'm sorry,
but that's the thing though. That territory would breed these great teams together, and eventually, if the team wasn't going to last, they would break these guys off and have them go against each other, and make a ton of money doing that.
Yeah.
But it was always tag team wrestling in the Mid-Atlantic and Georgia. It really, in those two territories, was the preeminent main event style, almost the same way that the trios matches in Mexico are.
Yeah, and the Assassins were down there.
The Assassins in Georgia.
Even dopes like Don Kernodle made big money as part of teams.
Yeah. Find you a Sergeant Slaughter to carry the act,
Yeah.
For all the bad things you can say about Jim Crockett's, their lack of, or rather their ECW-esque accounting, their inability to keep a budget, they're wanting to keep up with the Joneses, and those Joneses were Vince McMahon. One of the things that Jim Cornette says all the time, the major strength of Jim Crockett Productions was they really knew how to make something last. When they had a hot act, they got every bit of juice out of that hot act for months, if not years to come. The WWE, if they'd had to learn a lesson from anyone, they learned how to make you think about Hogan Savage and how that lasted 2 years. That's I think one of the big, if not the talent. That's one of the major things that Jim Crockett Productions really contributed to the wrestling world was their ability to take an act and make it last.
Well, and I think it's worth pointing out too that in terms of Jim Crockett Promotions, the only person that really wanted to try to compete with Vince was Jim. Pretty much every other member of the family, from his mother to the two brothers that were involved in the promotion, they all wanted to continue to focus on the Mid-Atlantic territory, expand slowly, and make sure that business was good at home. And if you want to point to two things that really brought about the downfall of Jim Crockett Promotions and forced the sale to Ted Turner, it was moving Starrcade out of the Mid-Atlantic territory and into the Midwest when they went to Chicago, and the absolutely doomed purchase of the UWF.
And let's throw in Central States and Florida on top of that.
Yeah. I don't think that was quite as harmful as the UWF, but it certainly didn't help things.
No, it was still just throwing money away.
Yeah.
Cornette has said on multiple occasions, had Jim Crockett Productions just focused on their territory and their business and not tried to become the Southern version of WWF, they wouldn't be in business now, but they would have been in business longer than they were.
Right.
You mentioned the UWF, which was, of course, at one time Mid-South, which was at one time was a tri-state.
Tri-state.
So, I wanted to talk about them because when we talked about the Mania of WrestleMania and we looked at when Vince was building his all-star team, he took from two places mainly, one of which was Mid-South. The other one was Mid-Atlantic, but let's focus on Mid-South because the Rockin' 80s, the Rockin' Wrestling connection was built on the backs of those who came through Mid-South, Pat. So let's talk about Bill Watts and Mid-South and how he had some of the best talent going in the 70s and early 80s.
Bill himself was a part of that because Bill was a huge draw in that territory in the 70s as an in-ring competitor before he became the promoter of record.
Mm-hmm.
The North American Heavyweight Championship was their predominant championship. And really through the course of the 70s, it's more synonymous with two guys than anybody else. In the early 70s to the mid 70s, it's Bill. And Bill's feuding with all top guys who came through there. In the mid to late 70s, it's Dick Murdoch, the partner of Dusty Rhodes, who we talked about earlier. And Murdoch, who, many, many people will point to as just maybe the best guy they were ever in the ring with. And many people say the guy would have been the NWA World's Heavyweight Champion if he ever took a day in his life seriously. But wrestling was fun for Murdoch. He was there to have a good time and not only entertain himself, but entertain the crowd and the boys on top of that, and drink a case of Coors Light and go do it again the next day. And so Dickie, in a lot of ways, was maybe more relatable as a common man than Dusty in that respect, to at least the working class. But what happened was Mid-South is probably one of the first territories, along with World Class, to really commit to a younger generation and elevate them into a main event level quicker than other companies. In the late 70s, two guys who were really a big part of that were the aforementioned Paul Orndorff, who they really saw as a potential star and really pushed up the ladder. And probably the bigger one, and one of the biggest, if not the biggest that came through there other than JYD, was Ted DiBiase,
Right.
who had been around the territories, but really more than any other territory would probably call Mid-South his home. And Teddy really came up through the ranks there and became a legitimate top guy in the territories by the end of the 70s, largely because of what he was able to do in that territory. In the mid-70s, there was a power shift where Leroy McGurk, who had been the promoter for a long time there, and Leroy was blind. He'd gotten blinded at one point in a car accident permanently. And he had a daughter who many people will remember as Mike McGurk, the female ring announcer from the WWF in the late 80s and early 90s, he wanted a boy so bad he named his daughter Mike.
It happens.
But eventually there was a power struggle between he and Bill when Bill started buying interest in the company. And eventually Bill bought Leroy out and sent him on his way, and Bill took over. And one of the smart things that Bill did that I don't think he ever gets enough credit for was looking for the next generation of talent to elevate and build around, to have a lasting, long product. And again, he saw guys like Orndorff, who came out of the NFL for the New Orleans Saints and had been a great collegiate athlete and had a tremendous look. Very few people in this business have ever looked as good as Paul Orndorff did in his prime. And then you had a guy like Teddy, who, yes, Yeah, the Land of a Thousand Dances video. Instead of clapping, he's kissing his biceps.
I will never forget our conversation about that. It's like Paul Orndorff has no idea what the fuck to do in this video, so he's just kissing his muscles. It comes natural.
But on the flip side of that, you have Teddy, who also collegiate football star at West Texas State, the home of many, many wrestlers before and since. But a guy who was such a ring general, so quick, who's a second generation wrestler. And his dad, Iron Mike DiBiase, was so beloved by the generation that came after Mike that they all wanted to take care of Teddy and show him the right way to do things. And so he instantly was beloved by these guys because he was carrying on Mike's legacy. This is Mike's son. And his mom was a wrestler too, Helen Hild. But there was so much respect for Teddy, who came in very humble, that they started elevating these younger guys, knowing that, okay, Bill even knew, I can't be on top forever. I'm getting old, man. People don't want to see me at this point. So he started bringing these younger guys in and putting them up and over. And he had such a knack for seeing young talent and what they could do. And probably the crown jewel of which was when he brought a guy named Sylvester Ritter in from Canada, who was wrestling as a heel, Big Daddy Ritter, but saw this guy just ooze charisma and turned him into arguably still the biggest black superstar the wrestling business has ever seen in the Junkyard Dog.
I think the other thing that Bill really understood, as far as being the guy that ran the territory and being the booker of record, as Pat mentioned, not only did he understand the necessity of bringing in that younger generation and developing them when so many promoters in so many territories have failed to do that, he also understood the value of just a sheer attraction and what it meant to bring Andre in for 2 weeks or to every so often dust off Big Cat Ernie Ladd.
Yeah.
Because they had name value and were immediately credible, and he could use those attractions to get his guys over and let them go back to wherever they wanted to go back to, whether it was retirement or New York or Florida or whatever it may be. And they were none worse for wear. They came in, they made good paydays, and they got out. But Bill's talent always looked better after working with those guys. And so he really, for all of his character flaws as a human and alleged character flaws as a human, Bill's one of the smartest bookers that the industry has ever seen. And a lot of modern bookers would do well to pay attention to what he did right.
And another guy who is from that Eddie Graham learning tree, which is an absurd learning tree. We talk about family trees. The Eddie Graham booking learning tree, ladies and gentlemen. If you ever really want to deep dive, good Lord.
And you've got Dusty, you've got Kevin Sullivan, you've got Bill Watts,
Paul Heyman.
Yeah.
So when Pat and I were doing the Mania of WrestleMania, one of the things that we made a point to people was that the WWF doesn't exist without the good things they could learn from Bill Watts and Mid-South, Jim Crockett and Mid-Atlantic. Another place where the WWE takes the best lessons and applies them to a successful company is World Class Championship Wrestling, the home of the Von Erichs, which I have to ask, Gavin, have you seen the Iron Claw yet?
I haven't, just because I generally don't have time to sit down and watch a movie in one setting these days.
So if he doesn't wear a feathered boa, I'll be very upset.
So you haven't gotten to see the Iron Claw. You should. It's pretty good. My kids loved it. It was very sad. My assessment of the movie was basically, I wish it had been sadder. It didn't quite have the emotional gut punch I needed it to. But
yeah, they forgot Chris.
Movie. Well, they edited Chris out of the movie. But
there's no way the movie could compete with real life in that situation.
No. You want to talk about angering God since Job. Pat, what did you think of the Iron Claw in 50 words or less?
Good. As a film structure, it works for the most part pretty decent.
Mm-hmm.
They are missing beats in the narrative of Kerry's suicide, for example. Spoiler. Like they really needed to beef more into that to make it more impactful, and they didn't.
Right.
I understand there's only so much time to tell the story, and I think they did the most they could with what
I
they
didn't
had.
love how they handled Carrie's suicide because that's a lot more tragic than they
Right.
presented on screen.
My biggest problem was the casting, and
Hmm.
Kevin being significantly bigger than Carrie was just not ever going to sit right with me watching it, knowing who
Sure.
they were.
Yeah.
And it works well for non-wrestling fans, and that's great. But those of us who knew and followed and remember and everything, there's a lot of things they miss.
Right.
But we're the niche of the audience, we have to remember, just like how Marvel movies aren't made for Marvel fans.
So let's talk about the actual World Class Championship Wrestling, Gavin. Biggest act of the 70s. Who makes World Class back in the 70s? It's the Von
Oh,
Erich.
it's always Fritz. Fritz is always the driving force, whether he's the guy in the ring or the guy writing the checks and running the book. Everything else, everyone else is secondary to Fritz.
Okay. What's some of the most impactful stuff we could tell our audience about World Class from the 70s, Pat?
So Fritz, when he's promoting Dallas, essentially, the biggest thing they're probably responsible for is people have to remember Texas is a very large geographic state.
Right.
At one time, Texas had 4 active full-time territories running within the state, all congruently, plus Houston running as a city that those guys all booked a big show in under Paul Bosch at the Sam Houston Coliseum. So the thing was, the primary booking office for all the talent was Fritz. So essentially, for the Sam Houston Coliseum shows, which are the biggest shows in the state with the best payoffs under Paul Bosch, the talent still had to largely be booked through the Dallas booking office, which is who went through Fritz. Joe Blanchard in San Antonio for Southwest did not have that access. The Funks in Amarillo did not have that. The Guerreros in El Paso did not have that. So these territories are all running at the same time. Realistically, everything ran through Dallas. And when you have that kind of control, you're always going to be the big dog in the park there. And so Fritz, through his machinations of becoming the top star of that territory in the late 50s into the 60s, buying into that booking office and buying out the promotion and being the majority owner of it, allowed him to control not just his destiny, but the state. And what they did was they would ship these guys around enough where nobody got stale over time. There were always going to be a singular guy in each territory that you could count on to be your top guy and draw the money. But Spoiler, who was such an underrated talent, who was very big in the 70s, Don Jardine, maybe the best mass wrestler of the time, to go from working a program with Fritz over the what we call the American Heavyweight Championship, which was the big title there for a while until it became its own entity. And he would work a program with Fritz, and they trade the title back and forth. And then he would disappear and go to Southwest for Joe Blanchard. And then they would bring in a Johnny Valentine, and Johnny Valentine would work with Fritz before he would go back to Mid-Atlantic. And then Fritz would work with, say, a Terry Funk for a little while coming up from Amarillo. And Fritz would go return the favor and work in Amarillo for a little while because it was close and they draw big houses. So Texas really essentially ran through Dallas. And Dallas, because of its machinations, really allowed these territories to run successfully because it controlled the booking of the talent and where they went.
Okay. Before we talk about the last wrestler in my picture tonight, and I asked you guys one final question, I do want to bring up the Pacific Northwest territory, and I do it because when I was watching WCW in the 90s, and they would go to the Cow Palace, they always talked about it with such reverence. When you and I talked about the Mania of WrestleMania, we talked about the Roddy Piper Valentine feuds and all of that, and Roddy Piper was a big North, I believe that's where he makes his bones, is the Pacific Northwest. So the San Francisco, Washington, Portland areas, Pat, what's the significance of that in the 70s?
Well, San Francisco was not a part of the Pacific Northwest. San Francisco was its own promotional entity in Northern California owned by Roy Shires. And it was home to Ray Stevens, Pat Patterson, Pepper Gomez, acts like that at the time. Pacific Northwest was,
for those kids that don't know, Pat Patterson, godfather of professional wrestling in the WWF. For all his faults, and there's many, and for all the bad stories that have been said about him, he's also the wrestling genius that made a lot of stuff behind the scenes happen, and what you saw on screen look as good as it did.
And Ray Stevens may be the greatest in-ring performer of all time, according to
That was
many
what I was
opinions.
going to chip in and say is West Virginia's own Ray Stevens, born in the home of the Mothman, Point Pleasant, West Virginia. Um, the stuff that he was doing in the 1960s would absolutely still hold up today. Not only in terms of believability and mat work, but his high-flying stuff. So many people have borrowed and outright stolen so many things from Ray Stevens through the years that even if you've never heard of the man, you could watch one of his matches and recognize every spot that you see because they've been used and reused ad infinitum for the last 60 years.
If Ray Stevens were alive today, he would slap the Young Bucks and say, "Stop it."
Probably, and then ask them to borrow money.
And they give it to him, those marks. All right, keep going.
But the Pacific Northwest, the stronghold of that territory was Portland, Oregon. And it's always referred to as the Portland. Like a lot of these territories we talk about, they're referred to by their key city that they're in. You know, the WWF was always New York. The AWA was Minneapolis. Mid Atlantic was Charlotte. You know, it was always like that. So for the Pacific Northwest, that was Portland, Oregon. But it ran shows the Washington area, parts of southwest Canada. They ran in a little bit in Montana, and the Washington State area, but it was a very small, self-contained territory. People like to work that territory because the promoter of record, Don Owen, who ran that territory from the 50s up until its end in the early 90s, was a fair, reputable man who was a good payoff man. And that's very hard to find in the wrestling business. What it was really, like we said, a self-contained territory because it was so far away geographically from everything else that it allowed it to build its own audience. And it really was the only game in town for a lot of stuff because also Oregon in that area did not have a lot of major professional sports outright. So if you wanted to see something, you had to go see PNW. And in the 70s, the territory had been running for a while and had really gotten steam. So in the 70s, it had its regular stars, which were guys like Dutch Savage, Apache Bull Ramos. But it was also, again, a launching pad for a lot of young talent because guys needed to go somewhere to get their feet wet. And when territories like the AWA or Jim Crockett or wherever didn't really need these guys, they would ship them off to Portland. And guess what? A lot of these guys found footing in Portland, not the least of which some of these names you may have heard who got their first real big break as a star in Portland: Jimmy Snuka, Jesse Ventura, Roddy Piper, the Sheep Herders, who would later be known as Luke and Butch, the Bushwhackers, Rick Martel, and some guys made a lifelong home essentially for their wrestling career in Portland because they were able to do it and maintain financial success there, like Buddy Rose, like Crippler Rip Oliver, like Billy Jack Haynes. A lot of these guys were able to just stay in that territory for forever because they were able to maintain what they did because that territory was self-sustaining for so long until national expansion crippled every territory. But to its credit, Portland was one of the last guys standing.
Territory, and I'd be remiss without bringing them up, and that's the AWA. Good old Vern Gagne. You watch much AWA growing up,
I did.
Gavin?
I did. I discovered it when Bockwinkel was still on top in the mid 80s. And I watched it all the way through to the miserable end with the Team Challenge series because at that point in my life, I was an absolute wrestling junkie and I would watch anything, no matter how bad it was.
What was the significance of the AWA in the 70s?
Kind of the same thing that we've talked about with some of these other promotions. Without the existence of the AWA from the 60s, 70s into the early 80s, Vince isn't able to go national. Because they built so much of the talent that Vince used to go national. I mean, certainly the obvious and the easy one to point to is Hogan, because it was in the AWA in the early 80s that Hogan really started to become the Hogan that we know. That was where you saw the genesis of that character.
Right.
But long before that, Bobby Heenan was Nick Bockwinkel's manager and an extraordinary in-ring talent.
To be clear, one of the things Pat said and I said on the WrestleMania is without Bobby Heenan, there is no Hulk Hogan in the WWF.
Absolutely. And to that end, you can almost give Gene Okerlund as much credit for that as well.
Oh, yeah.
Gene was the voice of professional wrestling for an entire generation of fans.
The greatest interviewer of all time, bar none.
Oh, there's nobody even close.
No.
Will you get out of here?
You know, his ability to ad lib, to think on his feet,
Oh yeah,
and to draw good promos
to
out
smoke a
of
cigar, eat pancakes, and then tell Hulk Hogan he's in no shape to work out.
to draw even out of bad promos something watchable, listenable, and significant.
We're live,
was
pal.
a gift.
Sorry, keep going.
You know, Vern, his focus was always on realism. He didn't care about the flashy gimmicks.
The name on the marquee is what, Gavin?
It's wrestling. and I think that it's interesting that despite that, you look at some of the people that really got their first national notoriety under Vern.
Yeah.
The Road Warriors. Jesse Ventura and Adrian Adonis, the East-West connection.
But that's true even in even the most modern of modern times, as far as modern goes back then, because the last guy that I can think of to come out of the AWA and become a big-time wrestling star, Scott Hall, Razor Ramon.
Yeah. And even to the end, when things were not what they once were, there was still good young talent there that was worth borrowing and taking, because it was there that you had Sean and Marty, the Midnight Rockers. You had Pat Tanaka and Paul Diamond, Bad Company. You had a guy named the Trooper that would eventually become the Patriot. You had guys that looked like they might become something and just never quite worked out, like DJ Peterson, Ricky Rice, Derek Dukes. But you know, if you go back to the 1970s, which is kind of what we focused on this evening, you know, Vern was very rooted in realism. He wanted guys that hit hard, that were believable, that were credible. And a lot of the names that we know from other territories spent some significant time with Vern. And they're exactly the type of guys that you would expect. Guys like Billy Graham, who could go in there and despite all of the flash, there was plenty of steak to go along with the sizzle. Wahoo McDaniel was a favorite of Vern's. Legendary tough guy in the world of professional wrestling. And even when you look into how Vern brought guys along and how he decided, yeah, you can work for me, and I'm going to let you break in under me. Guys like Brad Rangens trained with Vern and just absolutely ran guys through a meat grinder, because Brad was an Olympic level amateur wrestler. And so that type of conditioning and that type of dedication to realism and authenticity was what Vern expected from everybody that came through his territory.
Well, and Gavin, even the guys who didn't necessarily go through the territory, but talk about the guys that he trained in his barn in Corcoran, Minnesota.
Oh, and you know, Ric Flair is the top of the list there. Rick went in for one day with Vern and walked out, and eventually went back and completed his training. But you know, the list of guys that Vern trained, absolutely unbelievable.
Well, most of the 80s WWF roster, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, pretty much.
And he did this. The majority of these guys came through in the 70s, like we're talking about. Like Gavin mentioned Flair. You have Flair, Ricky Steamboat, Jim Brunzell, the Iron Sheik, who basically became the head trainer of that camp and worked these guys out. Sergeant Slaughter. Just the amount of talent that came through here that he produced that became a top guy elsewhere or nationally or whatever. Vern was a great promoter. No, he didn't adapt and change with the times, but that didn't stop him running. But you look at Vern's contributions as a trainer. My God, they're impressive. Maybe nobody better.
Blackjack Mulligan.
Oh, and just look at that. Look at the difference in styles among all these guys. Right. Yeah, they all came through under Vern.
John Nord. I mean, his son-in-law, Larry Zbyszko. The impact that Vern had, not only through the stars he created that went on to national fame elsewhere with the era of expansion. And Vern, unlike Bill Watts, Vern was never going to be the visionary that was able to adapt with change.
Imagine the world of the parallel universe where the NWA does actually kill Vince McMahon.
Yeah.